Chapter 4. Paddington Finds a Cure. Paddington closed the door behind him and stood for a moment mopping his brow. All in all, he felt he'd had a narrow escape. He wasn't quite sure what he'd escaped from, but he hadn't liked the look of things in the next room at all, and he was glad he'd retired from the scene. He felt even more pleased a few seconds later when the muffled sounds of voices broke out on the other side of the wall. From what he could make out through the keyhole, there appeared to be some kind of argument going on, and several times he distinctly heard Mr. Hynes thumping his desk. Gradually, however, the noise died away, and at last he was able to turn his attention to his new surroundings. After the previous room, it was slightly disappointing. Apart from an old hat stand laden with white coats, the only items of furniture were a desk, on top of which was an open bag containing a number of instruments, a swivel chair, and a big steel rack which seemed to hold a lot of large photographic negatives, and which occupied most of one wall alongside a second door. It wasn't a bit like some of the rooms he'd seen in the hospital, not in programmes on television anyway, with people rushing in and out, pushing trolleys and barking out orders. That apart, it was also a very cold room. From his few short visits to hospitals, Paddington had noticed they were usually very keen on fresh air, and Mr. Curry's was no exception. There were 3 windows in the room, all much too high to reach, and all of them wide open. Paddington began to feel pleased that Mrs. Bird had thought to provide him with a thermos flask full of hot cocoa in case he got delayed, and after several minutes had passed with no sign of anything happening, he undid the top and poured some of the liquid into the cup. A moment later, Paddington let out a yell, which echoed and re-echoed round the room, as he danced up and down, waving the cup with one paw and clutching his mouth with the other. Mrs. Bird was a great believer in making hot things as hot as possible, and for once even she had excelled herself. Hastily pouring the remains of the cocoa back into the thermos, Paddington replaced the top and then began peering inside the bag on the desk in the hope of finding a mirror so he could examine the end of his tongue. It was while he was doing this that a thoughtful expression gradually came over his face. In the past he'd often watched programmes about hospitals on television. In fact, he was very keen on some of them, particularly the ones where there was a lot of action, and he recognised several instruments in the bag as being identical to the ones Grant Dexter always carried when he made his rounds every Monday evening in Daredevil Doctor series. Gradually an ominous quiet descended on the room, a quiet broken only by the sound of heavy breathing and an occasional chink as Paddington investigated still deeper into the bag. It was some while later that the door leading to the corridor slowly opened, and a small figure dressed entirely in white peered out through the gap. The corridor was empty, but even if there had been anyone around, little but the closest inspection would have revealed the identity of the face behind the mask, as it looked furtively first one way and then the other. In fact, other than the unusual appearance of the coat, which reached right down to the floor, even Grant Dexter himself might have been forgiven if he'd met the wearer face to face and thought he was looking at a shortened version of his own reflection in a mirror. Apart from the mask, the head was almost completely enveloped in a white skull-cap, and this in turn was surmounted by a headband and lamp. A stethoscope was draped over the neck, and although a few whiskers, which had obstinately refused to stay folded, poked out through some gaps and might have provided a clue, the rest of the face was almost entirely hidden. Having carefully made sure no one was coming, Paddington closed the door again and turned his attention to the photographic plates hanging on the wall. Holding them up to the light in the way he'd seen Grant Dexter do many times before on television, he peered at them hopefully. But after a few minutes he changed his mind and decided to sit down in the chair behind the desk instead. As pictures they'd been most disappointing. As far as he could make out, most of them showed a lot of old bones, and half of those were broken. The swivel chair was much more interesting, and he spent some while swinging it round and round, gradually getting higher and higher until he was almost level with the top of the desk. Waving his paws wildly in the air in the way that Mr. Hynes had done, Paddington was about to give the chair a final heave, when suddenly the whole world seemed to turn upside down, and he found himself flying through the air. Everything went black for a moment, and then he landed in a heap on the floor with what appeared to be a ton weight on top of him. As he struggled to remove the weight, Paddington heard a patter of running feet in the corridor outside, and then the door suddenly burst open and a man in uniform rushed into the room. "Where is it? Where is it?" he cried, taking aim with a large red fire extinguisher. Paddington paused in his efforts to free himself. "Where is it?" he repeated in surprise. "Blimey!" The man looked down at the figure on the floor. "Are you all right, sir? I thought there'd been an explosion or something. One of them gas cylinders going up." Paddington thought for a moment. "I think I'm all right," he said at last, "but the room is still going round." "I'm not surprised," said the man, examining the wreckage. "Your seat's come off." Paddington looked round. "My seat's come off?" he repeated in alarm. "Probably ran out of thread," explained the man as he looked down to lend a helping hand. "I expect you was turning it round and round too quickly. You broke the end stop." He paused as he caught sight of a coloured badge in Paddington's lapel. Are you one of them gentlemen from overseas?" Paddington looked at him in amazement. "I come from darkest Peru." "Ah, no, I thought so by your badge. Oh, well, we all know you want to see, don't we?" "Do we?" exclaimed Paddington, looking more and more surprised. "I expect Mrs. Bird rang up." The man paused for a moment as if he hadn't heard right. "I think you'd best come along with me," he said, giving Paddington a very odd look. Working in a large London hospital, he'd become used to seeing strange sights. But somehow, now that he was able to get a better view, the figure standing in front of him surpassed even his previous experience. "We don't want to keep his nibs waiting," he continued, hastily opening the door. "He don't like that much." "I know he doesn't," agreed Paddington, looking pleased that at long last someone understood what he'd come for. "Thank you very much." The man looked at Paddington in astonishment as he picked up his basket. You're not taking that in with you?" "I've brought it for him." "Oh, well," the man scratched his head. "Have it your own way, but don't say I didn't warn you. And if you want my advice, you'll take them gloves off before you go in the ward." "Take my gloves off?" exclaimed Paddington hotly as the man disappeared up the corridor. "Those aren't gloves. They're paws." Taking a firm grip of a basket, he hurried after the man in uniform, giving the back of his head one of his very hard stares indeed as they passed through several sets of swing doors, along another corridor, and finally into a large, brightly lit room with a row of beds on either side. Paddington peered down the ward. "There's Mr. Curry," he said excitedly, waving his paw in the direction of a bed at the far end. "I can see his grapes." "I dare say it is," said his guide, putting a finger to his lips as a tall, imposing figure rose from a group gathered round a nearby bed and fixed his eyes on them. "And that's Sir Archibald. I can see his glares." "Sir Archibald?" repeated Paddington in surprise. "That's right," said the man, looking pleased. "We're just in time. He's doing his rounds." "Look," he said as Paddington hesitated. "You comes from overseas, right?" "Right." "And you've got a badge in your lapel, right?" "Right," agreed Paddington, rather more doubtfully as he looked down at his coat collar. "In that case you must be one of Sir Archibald's students. He takes them on his rounds every Monday morning. And if I were you," he gave Paddington an encouraging push, "I'd go and make my apologies to him before I was very much older. He don't look best pleased, in my way of thinking." Thanking the man for his trouble, Paddington picked up his basket again and hurried down the ward. He wasn't at all sure who Sir Archibald was, or why he had to apologise to him, but as he drew near and caught sight of the expression on his face, he had to admit that the porter was right about the great man's mood, and he hastily lifted the top part of his skull-cap and let it drop back into place before he bade him good morning. "Good afternoon's more like it." Sir Archibald glared at Paddington's outfit with a look of disgust. "It's ward round today, not operations. You'll be frightening the patients out of their wits. Now you are here," he continued sarcastically, pointing to the patient under examination, "perhaps you can give us the benefit of your advice. Let's hear your diagnosis." "My diagnosis?" exclaimed Paddington in alarm as he began unloading his basket. "There's a cherry cake and some calf's foot jelly, but I don't think Mrs. Bird mentioned one of those." "Calf's foot jelly? Keep
Did you say calf's foot jelly?
Grant Dexter always says it's very good if you're ill.
Grant Dexter? And who might he be?
You don't know Grant Dexter? Exclaimed Paddington, looking most surprised. He's in Daredevil Doctor every Monday. He's very good at curing people. All his patients get better.
I think he'd like to know what you feel about this patient,
hissed one of the other doctors, pointing to the man on the bed as a loud snort came from the direction of Sir Archibald.
Have a listen on your stethoscope,
murmured someone else, reaching over to undo the man's pyjama jacket. Do something! Paddington grew more and more confused as he listened to the crumbs of advice. Picking up a headset off the bed, he took the end of the stethoscope which someone had handed him and began hastily poking it on the man's chest as he listened hopefully.
Well, said Sir Archibald testily, may we have your considered opinion?
Paddington removed the headset. I can hear someone talking, he announced, looking most surprised. It sounds like Mrs. Dale's diary.
Mrs. Dale's diary?
Bellowed Sir Archibald.
You've picked up the radio headphones by mistake, and you're supposed to use the other end of the stethoscope.
The patient sat up in bed and stared at Paddington with growing alarm. Here, he exclaimed. He's not going to operate, is he? 'Cause if he is, I'm off. Rest assured, my dear sir, it's most unlikely.
As a doctor, you're a disgrace to your profession. Never in all my years.
A doctor? Paddington looked even more alarmed as he pulled off his mask. I'm not a doctor, I'm a bear. I've come to visit Mr. Curry. Sir Archibald seemed to grow visibly larger as he drew himself up to his full height. He took in a deep breath as if about to explode, and then something in Paddington's words caused him to pause.
Curry? Did you say Curry?
That's right.
Are you a friend of his?
Well, he lives next door. I'm not really a friend. I've brought him something to be going on with.
Pshaw!
Sir Archibald snorted.
That's the last thing he needs. That man's entirely without scruples.
Mr. Curry's without scruples? Repeated Paddington, looking most upset. I thought he'd only hurt his leg. Sir Archibald took a deep breath.
Scruples, Bear, are things that stop some people taking advantage of others.
Oh, I don't think Mr. Curry's got any of those, Sir Archibald. Mrs. Bird's always grumbling because he takes advantage of others. Sir Archibald and the others listened carefully as Paddington went on to explain all about the golf match and how Mr. Curry had persuaded him to act as caddy. Gradually, as the story unfolded, Sir Archibald's expression changed. When it was over, he gave a snort, and then, as he looked first up the ward towards Mr. Curry's bed and then at Paddington, a twinkle came to his eyes.
You any good at tricks, Bear?
Oh, yes, Sir Archibald. Bears are very good at tricks.
Thought you might be.
Sir Archibald rubbed his hands together briskly, then turned to the others.
I have a feeling this is one of those occasions when we don't stick to the book. We'll make the medicine fit the patient.
Bending down to adjust Paddington's mask, he began whispering in his ear. It was difficult to tell what Paddington was thinking because his face was almost completely hidden again, but he nodded his head vigorously several times, and then, a few moments later, followed the famous surgeon up the ward in the direction of Mr. Curry's bed. Mr. Curry was reading a newspaper, but when he caught sight of Sir Archibald, he lowered it and gave vent to a loud groan.
Oh, how's the patient today?
Asked Sir Archibald, removing a large bowl of grapes from the bed so that he could inspect Mr. Curry's leg.
Worse, much worse. I thought you might be, said Sir Archibald cheerfully. That's why we're going to operate.
Operate? Echoed Mr. Curry, suddenly growing very pale.
Did you say operate?
Sir Archibald nodded.
No good playing around with these things. I'd like to introduce you to a colleague of mine from overseas. He specialises in legs, does something or other to the knee. Nobody quite knows what, but it seems to work very well in the rainforest. Quite a few of his patients still manage to get around, after a fashion.
Mr. Curry stared uneasily at the small figure hovering by the side of the bed.
It's all right, said Sir Archibald, following his glance. There's no need to worry. we give him a box to stand on. I don't suppose he'll want to shake hands, Sir Archibald added hastily, as Mr. Curry leaned over the side of the bed. His own are a bit shaky.
But it was too late. A gleam of recognition came into Mr. Curry's eyes as he caught sight of Paddington's paws.
"Bear!" he roared, recovering himself in record time. "Bear! Up to your tricks again!"
Mr. Curry glanced first at Paddington, who was looking slightly crestfallen beneath his mask now the planet misfired, and then at Sir Archibald.
"Tricks like this are very bad for patients,"
Mr. Curry said slowly and loudly for the benefit of everyone else in the ward.
"I think I'm going to have another relapse."
As Mr. Curry lay back, Paddington hastily pulled off his mask and lifted the basket of food onto the bed in an effort to make amends.
"Careful, Bear. Mind what you're doing with that cake. I don't want crumbs in my bed. And no taking any of the grapes when I'm not looking. If I find empty stalks, I'll know the reason why."
He peered down the bed to where Paddington was busy unloading the basket.
"Have you brought the—"
Whatever else Mr. Curry was about to say was lost for all time, as suddenly, to everyone's surprise, the ward shook with a tremendous roar of pain, and the sheets flew into the air as he jumped out of bed and started dancing up and down in the middle of the floor.
"Bear!"
he roared, lifting his injured leg into the air like an acrobat as he tried to rub his foot.
"What have you done, Bear? I'll...
Mr. Curry's voice trailed away, and for the second time within the space of as many seconds he left a sentence unfinished as he glanced sheepishly round at the sea of faces. Sir Archibald turned to the sister in charge.
"It seems to me,"
he said, breaking the silence which followed Mr. Curry's performance,
"we have another bed free in the ward after all. Bear's cocoa,"
said Sir Archibald, holding up the empty thermos.
"I must remember this. Haven't seen quite such a remarkable cure in years. Must have been boiling hot, though."
"I don't think I'd screwed the top of my flask on properly, Mrs. Bird," explained Paddington. "It went all over Mr. Curry's foot." Mrs. Brown and Mrs. Bird exchanged glances. So much had happened in the space of a few minutes, they were feeling somewhat confused. First their house had shaken to the sound of Mr. Curry's front door being slammed. Then a large black car had drawn up outside number 32 Windsor Gardens, and to their amazement Paddington had emerged from the back seat, closely followed by a distinguished-looking gentleman carrying the basket of food and the thermos flask.
"All the best discoveries are made by accident," said Sir Archibald, seeing their looks of puzzlement. "And in my experience some of them take quite a lot of explaining afterwards."
Sir Archibald turned to Paddington, and as he did so a look of concern came over his face.
"You all right, Bear?"
Paddington felt under his coat with the end of a stethoscope he'd been given as a souvenir. "I think I'm having trouble with my beats, Sir Archibald," he announced faintly. Sir Archibald began to look even more concerned, and then he followed Paddington's eyes as they gazed hungrily at the shopping basket.
"I think there's hope. Given plenty of cake and biscuits, and some hot cocoa, that's most important."
"It's funny you should say that," remarked Mrs. Bird. "I was just about to make some." She paused as Sir Archibald hovered wistfully in the doorway. "Would you care for a cup?"
"I should not only care for one," said Sir Archibald, "I should consider it a great honour. After all, inventing cures is thirsty work, and bears aren't the only ones who like their 11s.